I was headed back from the Verde Valley, spent the day at Oak Creek Canyon. Oh, what a great getaway. And I stopped at the top of Mingus Mountain, pulled over. There's a great little turnout spot there. Decided to stretch, look back over the Verde. And I sat on this old stone wall looking out beyond and then glanced down below. And down maybe 100, 200 feet below me, I could see what looked like an old antique wagon wheel sticking up out of the mud and dirt. And I wasn't in any big hurry, so I thought, I think I'll grab the little pick shovel I carry behind the seat of the truck, climb down in there and do a little investigating. So I did. I worked my way to the bottom and started digging and unearthed what turned out to be the wreckage from an old stagecoach. And I knew it was a stagecoach because as I dug out the front wheel and axle, this little door panel dropped down, identifying it indeed as a coach. Well, I sat back on this old tree stump and finished off a bottle of water, and I thought, what was this old coach doing down here? How did it get here? And then I looked back up toward the highway, up where my truck was parked, and I could see just below that stone wall the remnants, or what was left of the old stagecoach trail over Mingus. And then I realized that old coach had probably plunged off the edge and met its fate at the bottom of this canyon. And I thought, gosh, what was going on? Who were the passengers? Were there survivors? What was their story? Well, I sat there thinking about the Old West, and I remember back in the late 1800s, Prescott was the heart of the territorial capital. And all the stagecoach runs headed over Mingus Mountain to points north, south, east, and west. And those night rides would often be canceled during the monsoon, the storm season that hits late in the summer. Because what starts out being a beautiful crystal clear day, nothing but blue sky and sunshine, suddenly changes. Without warning, the skies grow dark and gray. Thunderheads, as they're called, grow big. Angry sounds and sights of electrical storms begin. And because of that, those night rides over Mingus Mountain would typically be canceled, or at least postponed until morning, when the storms had passed and drivers could see their way clearly and safely. And when that would happen, when those storms were building at night, those passengers holding tickets for the night ride would all be asked to please, folks, gather down at the saloon and wait out the storm. There'll be plenty of food and drink, songs, games, gambling. We'll even have old piano man stay all night and play everyone's favorite tunes on the piano. And most folks gathered in good cheer. It was an excuse for a party. One night late, when the trip had been canceled and folks had gathered, one night late, the doors to the saloon flew open, and there standing in the dark doorway was Miss Lily Cantrell, the richest woman in all of Prescott. Everybody knew her. She was a beautiful Spanish woman. Her hair was jet black, and that night slicked back into a tight bun. Her lips were painted as red as the beautiful satin dress that she was wearing. She was dressed to travel, but that's what caught everyone's attention. For where would Miss Lily be headed on a night like this? What with storms brewing? She knew better. Yet there she was, standing in the doorway with her bags at hand, dressed to travel. Well, all eyes were on this beautiful woman. The gambling stopped, the piano man's fingers were still, and all eyes were looking at this beautiful woman as her eyes moved around the crowded, now very silent saloon as if she were searching for someone. And then she broke the silence and spoke. She said, I'm looking for a driver, someone willing to take me over the mountains tonight. Oh, I've already hired a private coach and a team of horses. But a driver is hard to come by, what with these storms brewing. But I am leaving tonight. Well, no one offered to drive Miss Lily over the mountains. No one was going to take a chance. So she put it to them this way. She said, very well, then I'm looking for a gambler, and my gold will make your gamble worth the while. And with that, she tossed out onto the floor a little pouch of gold, holding probably 5 times what the trip would usually pay a driver. And then there was the sound of a chair scooting across the wooden plank floor, and a tall, handsome gambler stood up from the poker table where he'd been playing. He tipped his hat and he said, "Evening, ma'am, the name's Dawson, and I'll drive your coach tonight." People couldn't believe their ears. Who was this stranger, this foolish gambler? She just smiled and nodded at him and spoke. "Very well, Mr. Dawson, we leave in 20 minutes. He nodded his head in approval. Then he brushed past her, slowing only long enough to bend down and pick up the little pouch of gold. And then he disappeared out at the door. Miss Lily turned to follow, but she stopped, looked back at the still very silent saloon, and uttered a few more words. She said, "Oh, by the way, there's room in my coach for a couple of more fools if anyone's willing to take a chance." And then she burst out laughing, knowing what everyone was thinking. Fools indeed, knowing that no one would dare to travel with her. Then she turned and disappeared out the door to join Dawson. But as Miss Lily was crossing Main Street, she felt a little tap on her shoulder. She turned around, and there stood Doc Haverty, the town doctor. And he asked if he could take her up on that offer. He said, "I have an important patient there in Jerome, the little mining town on the north slope or back side of Mingus, and well, I'd just as soon not put it off," he said. Well, Miss Lily was indeed surprised, but delighted. An old family friend like Doc. So the two of them, laughing, chatting, climbed aboard the coach. Dawson checked the rigging on the horses, pulled himself up under the driver's bench, gathered up the heavy leather lines and cracked them across the horses, turning the team down along Main Street. And as the coach worked its way through town, the freshly painted wheels of the rig flickered in the gas lamplight, and then began to flicker in the moonlight that was now breaking through the tumbling storm clouds high above in the summer sky. But right at the edge of town, Dawson pulled the team up to a complete halt. It was a sudden stop, jarring and jolting. Doc and Miss Lily looked out their coach windows just in time to see a young cowboy step from out of in front of the horses and walk back to the side of the coach. He pulled off a floppy-brimmed leather hat and was grinning from ear to ear, and he said, "Evening, folks, I'm headed to California, and I'm just too impatient to wait out the storm. I'd like to hitch a ride if I may. Oh, and ma'am, I've got the silver to pay my own way. Yes, sirree, I'm not looking for a handout." She stopped him with a gesture, glanced up top to Dawson. Dawson smiled, and she looked back at the young cowboy and said, "Climb aboard, cowboy, and save your silver. This trip's been paid for." "Oh, yes, ma'am," he said as he quickly threw his gear on up to Dawson, scrambling up after it to ride shotgun alongside the driver. And once his gear was stowed away, Dawson pulled the team out, and right away they were back up to speed. For the first few miles were just wide open prairie, easy going. But off in the distance, old Mingus Mountain was covered in more than the darkness of night. The thunderheads, clouds, had built up especially thick and heavy. And that constant flashing of lightning was kind of like a warning sign, a warning to these foolish travelers to turn back. But they weren't. No, they were full speed ahead into a night they'd never forget. Well, the coach finally started to work its way up the mountain. The rain now began to really pour and pelt. It took all of Dawson's skill to keep those horses pulling, bucking up against that hot, wet harness, trying to reach the summit. The horses began to trip and stumble, losing their footing in the soft sandstone and mud. But finally, they reached the top. Whew, and that's when they started their long haul down the other side. But that's where the trail got real tricky. It dropped off in places some 200 and 300 feet straight down. And it took all of Dawson's skill as a driver to keep those horses pulling, bucking up against that hot, wet harness, moving down the trail. And then suddenly there was this unbelievable boom of thunder and a blinding flash of lightning. The horses bolted and were out of control. Dawson hollered from up top to hold tight. Young cowboy pulled back on the brake lever, locking up the wheels, but the coach kept sliding, slipping off. Then over the edge. And for a split second, there wasn't a sound. Not a whisper in that night air. And then there came a sharp squeal from Penny, the lead mare, one of the horses pulling the coach, and screams from inside, and then that twisting, cracking, crunching sound of timber splitting as the coach tumbled its way down to the very bottom of the canyon below. Man and beast going with it. Well, no one knows how long it was before Doc came to. He managed to clear some wreckage from off of his legs. He stood. His ankle was badly twisted, but he moved toward the young cowboy who was sitting up on a busted wagon wheel, stunned and dazed, but obviously not badly hurt. They moved to help him up, and then the two of them heard a moaning, groaning sound coming from out of the brush behind them. Dawson came out staggering, holding his head. It was badly gashed, cut clear to the skull, but somehow he'd managed to stop the bleeding. It looked as if they'd all pulled through. But wait, where was Miss Lily? They started to split up to look for her, but right away Dawson said, there she is. And they saw her walking toward them from out of the darkness. Her beautiful satin dress was torn and soiled. Her hair was all a mess. But it looked as if she too had made the fall. And in her usual confidence, she walked right up and said, "Well, Doc, where the heck are we?" And Doc, based on his calculations, he said, "I think we're just a few miles from Jerome now, what with having taken this shortcut down the mountain." Some shortcut down the mountain. But his humor was a much-needed remedy to their aching bones and bruised bodies. It felt good to chuckle and laugh a bit until the young cowboy stopped them, pointed out, "Yeah, you can laugh, but all the horses have run off." Well, all except for one. Looks like old Penny, the lead mare. And she lay just a few yards away, still in harness, cold and lifeless. It looked as if this horse had not been as lucky as the rest of them. So that meant a long, hard walk out of the canyon. Doc said they'd better get started, so with him leading the way, they headed off down what looked like to be an old bear or deer trail in the direction of Jerome. And as they stumbled along through the night, as they worked their way through the darkness, their aches and pains seemed to work themselves out. Doc's sprained ankle stopped aching. Dawson's split head stopped throbbing and pounding with every step that he took. And by the time they could see the lights of Jerome off in the distance, they were all feeling a whole lot better, for this had certainly been one night to remember. But then as the four of them reached the very edge of town, they stopped. And this very strange, almost haunting breeze blew across their faces and through their hair. Something wasn't quite right. Two prospectors walked right in front of them, didn't say a word. Surely they'd seen the dried mud and blood, yet no one offered to lend a hand. Miss Lily moved to an old Indian woman who was pulling a blanket from a saddlebag. "Excuse me," she said, "excuse me, ma'am, but the coach we were riding in." And then Dawson's touch to Miss Lily's shoulder sent a cold chill across her back, and Dawson spoke. "Don't you see, Miss Lily? The old woman can't hear you. She can't see you. You're a ghost. We're all ghosts." They were victims of their foolish night ride across Mingus Mountain. The young cowboy dropped down and cried out, No, it's just not fair. I've got my whole life ahead of me. I'm headed to California." Or so he thought. "What'll I do now, Miss Lily?" he cried. "What'll I do now?" And looking down at him, she said, "I guess we just continue our journey, don't we, gentlemen?" And they all nodded their heads as Dawson pointed to the other end of town, where waiting for them was the phantom coach, the very coach they'd gone over the edge in. The team of horses back in harness, snorting and pawing at the ground, anxious for their cargo of foolish gamblers to climb back aboard. And one by one they did. Once seated and settled, Dawson slammed the door to the coach, pulled himself up onto the driver's bench, and for the last time gathered up the heavy leather lines and cracked them across the still wet haunches of the horses, turning and driving the team back out into the mountains. And just as that morning sun broke through the night sky, Doc, cowboy and the beautiful Miss Lily all simply disappeared into a rare morning mist that rose high above the timberline upon Mingus. And what really makes the story amazing is that today, late-night travelers driving over Mingus Mountain, truckers en route, families on vacation, have actually reported having seen what appears to be an antique stagecoach working its way across the old granite trail. And what really makes the story fun is that today, the team of horses pulling the coach, there's one horse missing. And legend has it, it's old Penny, the lead mare, the one horse thought to have died or perished in the fall, but who was in fact the only survivor of the fool's ride over Mingus Mountain.